Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a dim, misty village somewhere deep in Eastern Europe, where the chill of the night carries whispers of something far darker than mere shadows. You trudge along muddy lanes, hearing the faint creak of old wooden doors and the nervous rustle of villagers locking themselves in for the night. Above, the moon hides behind clouds, and the fear that lingers is not just of wolves or thieves, it's of something far more relentless and cruel. You probably won't survive this story without feeling a little shiver creep up your spine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's oddly comforting to know where in the world we're creeping together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fear of vampires, those bloodthirsty revenants, is not some Hollywood invention or gothic romantic nonsense. It is a real, visceral terror that shaped the lives and landscapes of countless Eastern European villages for centuries. The origins of this fear stretch far back to medieval times, when people first encountered unexplained deaths and strange phenomena after loved ones passed away. It wasn't just about superstition, but about survival in a world where the boundary between life and death felt dangerously thin. You imagine a world where death did not always mean peace. Instead, it often meant a lurking menace returning from the grave, craving the life force of the living. Villagers saw in these tales a way to explain plagues, sudden illnesses, and the ever-present dread that death might not be the end, but rather the beginning of something horrifying. It's fascinating to realize that the vampire myth arose from very real human fears: fear of death, decay, and the unknown. One mainstream historical fact is that the earliest vampire legends in Eastern Europe date back to the 11th and 12th centuries, with mentions in medieval chronicles describing revenants or strigoi, terms for the dead who rose from their graves. These early stories were grounded in folklore, but began to crystallize into a more specific fear as the centuries passed. The weird, often grotesque images of corpses not decomposing properly or having fresh blood around their mouths fueled these beliefs. On the quirkier side, some villagers believed that the way a corpse looked in the grave could predict whether it would become a vampire. For example, if a body appeared unusually red or plump, it wasn't a sign of good health in the afterlife. It was a warning sign that the dead might rise. The idea that rotting, desiccated corpses could also be vampires was a later development. Initially, it was the oddly well-preserved bodies that raised suspicion. Historians still argue whether the vampire fears developed independently in isolated communities, or if they spread along trade routes and cultural exchanges. Some believe the myth is a syncretic blend of pagan beliefs about spirits and Christian ideas about sin and the afterlife. Others think the vampire stories might be rooted in misunderstandings of natural decomposition or diseases that caused strange symptoms in the dead. In truth, the vampire fear was less about some supernatural boogeyman and more about how people coped with grief, disease, and the mystery of death. The stories offered an explanation for the unexplainable and a way to assert some control, however brutal, over the terrors lurking in the night. Picture yourself in a cold, damp village where every unfamiliar cough or pale face sparks panic. You hear about a recent burial where the corpse seemed to have fresh blood on its lips, or neighbors claim to see someone walking the streets at night after dying days ago. The entire community falls into a shared paranoia, and everyone watches the graveyards closely, fearing the dead might rise and turn neighbors into victims. So, as you settle deeper into this dark world, know this: what we now see as superstition was once a survival mechanism, a way of managing overwhelming fear with rituals and stories. And tonight, we're going to trace exactly how these fears came alive and shaped every corner of village life for generations to come. You wake to the distant sound of church bells tolling, not a call to prayer, but a somber announcement. The plague has arrived in the village. The air feels heavier. The scent of smoke and herbs mix in with something fouler. Villagers clutch their families tighter, eyes darting nervously, as the shadow of death creeps relentlessly through the streets. It's not just death that terrifies them now. It's what comes after. The link between death, disease, and vampire panic is as tangled as the vines choking the forest beyond the village borders. You might think the fear of vampires was just some dark fantasy, but was born from real terror when plague outbreaks turned entire communities into ghost towns. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, killed millions, and with it, a wave of superstition swept through Eastern Europe. Suddenly, every unexplained death was a potential sign that the dead were not resting, and worse, that they might return to prey on the living. One well-documented historical fact is that during plague years, villagers often resorted to exhuming bodies suspected of being vampires. These corpses were said to have fresh blood on their mouths, or an unusually fresh appearance, both signs that they were feeding on the living. The macabre act of digging up graves was both a desperate attempt to protect the community and a gruesome expression of their fear. Interestingly, some scholars suggest that symptoms of certain diseases contributed to the vampire myth. For instance, tuberculosis could cause a person to appear pale and thin, while rabies might lead to aggression and biting, behaviors easily misinterpreted as signs of vampirism. Meanwhile, a corpse's bloating and blood seeping from the mouth due to natural decomposition were terrifying to villagers unfamiliar with these processes. Historians still argue whether vampire panics were mostly a rural phenomenon or if they also spread into cities during plague outbreaks. Some evidence points to intense rural vampire hunts, while urban centers seem more inclined to rely on official medical explanations. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, as fear and rumor crossed social and geographic boundaries with alarming speed. You imagine yourself at a night vigil in a village square, where the living gather with stakes, holy water, and garlic, ready to confront any sign of the undead. The fear is palpable. Each corpse opened might be the one that springs to life and drags someone into the cold grip of death again. Stories spread of families who found their dead relatives feeding on neighbors. Stories so terrifying, they became part of the community's very identity. On a stranger note, there are accounts of villagers using crocodile dung as a kind of early sunscreen to protect themselves from the supposed powers of vampires. While this sounds bizarre, it highlights how far people were willing to go to protect themselves, even if the methods seem ridiculous now. As you walk back through this fearful world, remember that plague was more than just a disease. It was a force that reshaped belief and behavior. The panic over vampires was a way for communities to make sense of death and prevent further catastrophe. So, next time you think about vampires, consider that their bloodthirsty image may be, in part, a reflection of humanity's desperate fight against invisible killers that none could see or understand. You kneel beside a freshly disturbed grave, the soil still loose, the air thick with damp earth and the faint metallic scent of decay. Your heart races because, in this village, certain signs on the dead mark a terrible fate, not just for the corpse, but for the entire community. The fear of vampires isn't just superstition. It's an urgent response to what villagers believed were unmistakable warnings from the dead themselves. How did they know if someone was becoming a vampire? The clues were unsettling and often hinged on the condition of the body in the grave. If the corpse appeared unusually red or preserved, with blood around the mouth or nails still intact, villagers took this as evidence that the dead were not resting peacefully. You might think this sounds strange, but back then, natural decomposition was a mystery. The way bodies changed after death, sometimes swelling, sometimes bleeding from orifices, was terrifying and easily misread. Historically, it's a documented fact that many vampire legends originated from misinterpretations of corpses' post-mortem appearances. For instance, bloating of the body can force blood out of the mouth, giving the gruesome impression of fresh feeding. Additionally, skin that darkens or turns reddish could be seen as a sign of vitality in death rather than decay. On the quirkier side, some communities believed that a corpse's hair and nails continued to grow after death, proof that the person was still alive in a sinister way. We now know this is an optical illusion caused by the skin retracting, but at the time, it was terrifying evidence. Historians still argue whether these signs were mostly the result of natural processes misunderstood, or if some reports were deliberately exaggerated to justify the brutal rituals that followed. It's likely a mix of both. Fear can make people see what they expect to see. In fact, villagers sometimes relied on neighbors' accounts of nighttime noises, shadowy figures near the grave, or livestock behaving strangely as additional proof that a vampire was among them. These behavioral signs fed into a growing paranoia. If a person had died recently and the village's animals shied away from their home, suspicion would grow. Imagine yourself in the role of a villager whose best friend has just been buried. You hear stories of the corpse wandering at night, and when you see the grave disturbed or the body not fully decomposed, a chill runs down your spine. Your mind races between grief and terror, and you begin to question the very nature of death. This blend of physical evidence and community fear created a self-reinforcing cycle of suspicion and ritual. It's easy to see how the signs of vampirism became accepted wisdom, passed down and strengthened by the need for protection. One particularly eerie fringe belief was that vampires could shapeshift into animals or mist, which made it difficult to know who was safe to trust. This kept entire villages on edge, watching not just the dead, but their neighbors with suspicion. So, as you contemplate these signs, remember, the way people interpreted death reveals more about their struggle with the unknown than about any real undead menace. The fear was real, the signs were real to them, but what lay behind those signs was a complex mix of biology, psychology, and folklore. You find yourself standing at the edge of the village graveyard, where the air is heavy with damp soil and the soft rustling of dead leaves. It's night, but not just any night. The villagers are gathered here, eyes wide and hands trembling as they hold vigil over the recently buried. The graveyard isn't just a place of rest, it's a front line in a desperate battle against the dead who might rise again. Graveyard vigilance was a widespread and often terrifying practice. Villagers took turns sitting with the bodies, armed with sharp stakes, crosses, and whatever weapons they could muster. Their goal was grim: to watch the corpse until it either decomposed fully or was confirmed safe from becoming a vampire. Sometimes the vigil lasted days, with communities united by fear and a shared sense of duty. A historical fact that stands out is that these vigil practices are documented as early as the 17th century, especially in regions like Transylvania and the Balkans. Records from local authorities even mention organized watches at cemeteries during plague times to prevent vampire activity. The graveyard was both a sacred and dangerous place, where life and death seemed to blur. On a stranger note, some villagers believed that placing bells on graves or tying ropes to coffins could alert them if the dead tried to escape. The sound of the bell ringing at night would send them rushing to drive a stake through the vampire's heart. Imagine sitting in the cold dark, listening for that ominous jingle. Sleep is a distant memory. Historians still argue whether the intensity of these vigils reflected genuine belief or if social pressures forced participation. Were people truly terrified of the dead, or was this a ritual that bonded the community and kept social order? It's likely both, with fear and community cohesion intertwined. The vigil wasn't just practical, it was deeply psychological. Watching over a corpse until it crumbled into dust was a way for villagers to confront their own fears of death and the unknown. It transformed the graveyard into a place of active struggle rather than quiet mourning. Picture yourself clutching a lantern, shadows flickering over the mossy stones as your companions murmur prayers. The wind carries distant howls, and every rustle makes your skin crawl. Suddenly, a bell tinkles softly from across the yard. Your heart leaps, and you grip your stake tighter. These nighttime watches shaped village life profoundly. They dictated when people could sleep, how they interacted, and what they believed about death's power. The vigil was a collective defense against a nightmare made flesh, or at least that's how they saw it. So, as you imagine this eerie watch, remember that graveyard vigilance was both a symptom of and a solution to the crushing fear that death was not the end, but a dangerous beginning. You grip the rough wooden stake tightly, the splinters digging into your palm As you approach the freshly dug grave, the moonlight casts eerie shadows on the disturbed earth, and the village behind you is silent, save for the occasional creak of timber or whispered prayers. Tonight, you are part of a grim ritual designed to keep the dead where they belong, buried, sealed, and helpless. The brutal custom of driving stakes or spikes through corpses is one of the most chilling and tangible signs of how seriously the villagers took their vampire fears. This wasn't symbolic theater, it was a fierce, violent act meant to pin the dead down, literally and figuratively, so they couldn't claw their way back to the living world. Historical records reveal that in many parts of Eastern Europe, especially in the Carpathian region, stakes were driven through the heart, throat, or even abdomen of suspected vampires. Sometimes corpses were decapitated, with heads buried separately or nailed to the coffin lids. These methods aimed to prevent the strigoi, or upia, from rising. Oddly, the stakes themselves were often made from hawthorn, ash, or oak, trees considered sacred or powerful. Villagers believed these woods had protective properties that could bind supernatural forces. In some regions, the stakes were sharpened and soaked in substances like garlic juice or holy water before being used. Historians still argue whether these brutal methods were primarily spiritual precautions or practical attempts to prevent grave disturbances caused by natural decomposition. Some scholars suggest that the villagers observed corpses moving or walking due to gases building up inside the body, and the stakes were a way to stop this terrifying spectacle. A quirky detail that often raises eyebrows. In some villages, after staking, bodies were exhumed and tested again weeks later to check if they had moved or appeared less decomposed. If so, additional measures like burning or decapitation were taken. Imagine the grim scene of villagers digging up their own dead relatives to ensure they were really dead and not a threat. The practice was not limited to stakes either. Some communities buried bodies face down or with scythes placed near the neck, hoping the vampire would be decapitated if it tried to rise. Others used iron chains or heavy stones to weigh down coffins. Think about the psychological weight of these customs. Not only were they violent and invasive, but they also showed a deep desperation to control what seemed uncontrollable. For villagers who had lost so many to disease and hardship, staking was a small way to regain some power over death. It's worth noting that not all these rituals were universally accepted. Some religious authorities frowned upon or outright condemned staking, seeing it as superstition, conflicting with church doctrine. This tension added to the complexity of vampire fears and practices. So, as you stand there in the moonlit graveyard, stake in hand, know that these brutal customs were born from terror, grief, and the fierce human need to protect the living from the horrors of the dead. You walk through the dense, whispering forest that skirts the village. The crunch of leaves beneath your feet, the only sound accompanying your cautious steps. The night feels alive with unseen eyes watching, and you can almost taste the chill of the stories carried in the wind. Tales of spirits, demons, and restless dead. Among these, the vampire looms large, a fear so pervasive it shaped not just burial customs, but entire village defenses. Walls, fences, and household charms were as vital to villagers as food and fire. You'd be surprised how much effort was spent on vampire-proofing homes. Wooden stakes hammered through doors and windows, garlic hung from beams, and mirrors were strategically placed to trap or ward off evil reflections. Even iron tools and objects were scattered throughout homes, believed to repel the undead. It wasn't just about protection. It was about creating a bubble of safety amid uncertainty. Historically, many Eastern European villages employed these architectural and household precautions. Some homes were even built with vampire doors or hidden compartments where villagers could hide if they suspected a nocturnal attack. These small but significant features reveal how embedded the fear was in daily life. A particularly quirky practice involved placing bricks or stones inside the coffin or around the grave. The idea? To weigh down the vampire or prevent it from rising easily. You can picture villagers hefting heavy stones over their loved ones' graves, hoping that if the dead tried to escape, they'd be trapped beneath the weight. Historians still argue whether these architectural defenses were primarily practical responses to disease and robbery, or whether they were sincere attempts to hold back supernatural forces. Some scholars point out that many of these practices overlapped with common-sense security measures, blurring the lines between superstition and pragmatism. One fascinating fringe belief was that mirrors could confuse or trap vampires by reflecting their image. Since folklore often stated that vampires had no reflection, mirrors became tools both for detection and defense. Imagine a village where every household has a carefully placed mirror, not to admire yourself, but to catch a glimpse of lurking evil. You can almost hear the murmur of villagers talking about these home defenses, sharing tips and stories while weaving their fears into everyday life. Some even believed that the way a house was oriented, facing east or away from certain landmarks, could influence its safety. The ever-present fear seeped into the very architecture and layout of villages. Houses built close together, narrow winding streets, and the positioning of wells and communal spaces all carried an undercurrent of protection rituals. As you imagine this, realize that these physical measures are a window into how communities coped. The boundary between life and death wasn't just at the graveyard. It was at every doorstep, every window, every hearth. So, as you settle into this layered world of fear and defense, remember that the battle against vampires wasn't just fought with stakes and crosses. It was fought with the very structures that sheltered the living. You step into the village square as dawn breaks, the soft orange light casting long shadows over stone cottages and cobbled streets. Today, the villagers prepare for a ritual that has become as routine as planting crops or gathering firewood, a ceremony meant to cleanse the community and protect it from the unseen terrors lurking beyond the forest. This is the day of the exorcism. Exorcisms targeting suspected vampires were often communal events, where priests or local healers would perform rites intended to purify the dead and the living alike. These ceremonies combined Christian prayers with older pagan customs, a potent mix reflecting the tangled beliefs of the region. You witness villagers bringing herbs, garlic, and holy water, while chanting echoes across the crisp morning air. A key historical fact is that such exorcisms were not limited to individuals, but sometimes involved entire families or even villages during times of plague or mass death. The Church often sanctioned these rites, recognizing the psychological relief they offered to terrified communities. Interestingly, some exorcisms included the symbolic burning of clothing or belongings of the deceased to prevent the vampire spirit from returning. The act was as much about closure for the living as it was about stopping the undead. Historians still argue whether these rituals genuinely eased communal anxiety or whether they inadvertently reinforced vampire legends by dramatizing death and the supernatural. Some scholars suggest that the ceremonies served as social glue, reinforcing shared beliefs and communal identity in the face of chaos. One quirky detail is the use of poppy seeds or sand scattered around homes and graves during exorcisms, based on the belief that vampires were compelled to count every grain, keeping them occupied and away from the living. This obsessive-compulsive distraction tactic is a delightful oddity amidst the otherwise grim practices. Imagine standing in the crowd, feeling the weight of centuries of fear and hope mingling in the air, as the priest's voice rises and falls. The smell of burning herbs and incense mingles with the cool morning mist, weaving an atmosphere of solemnity and suspense. Exorcisms weren't just about driving out evil. They were a way for the living to reclaim control, to tell themselves that the nightmare could end. They helped people process grief, make sense of death, and rebuild a fragile sense of safety. So, as you watch this ancient ritual unfold, remember that beneath the prayers and smoke lies a very human desire to protect what we love from the unknown darkness. You wander into the dimly lit village chapel, where the air is thick with incense and murmured prayers. Here, religion and superstition intertwine tightly, each reinforcing the other in a delicate dance. The Church's role in vampire lore is as complicated as the legends themselves, sometimes a bastion of hope, other times a source of tension. Christianity shaped much of the vampire mythology in Eastern Europe, with priests wielding crosses and holy water as weapons against the undead. The Church preached that vampirism was a form of evil possession, and clergy were called upon to perform rites to cleanse souls and protect the living. A notable historical fact is that many church documents from the 17th and 18th centuries include detailed accounts of vampire cases, complete with official investigations and sanctioned executions. In some areas, ecclesiastical courts even tried suspected vampires, blending religious law with local customs. However, the Church's involvement wasn't always straightforward. Some clergy condemned vampire hunting as pagan superstition, urging villagers to rely solely on prayer and faith. Others actively participated in exhumations and stake-in rituals, endorsing the blending of folk beliefs and Christianity. Historians still argue whether the Church's stance was primarily pragmatic, aiming to maintain control and order, or genuinely driven by theological conviction. It's likely a mix of both, with local priests adapting to the fears and needs of their congregations. On the quirkier side, some churches incorporated vampire prevention directly into their architecture. For example, Churches might be built over ancient pagan sites thought to hold protective power, or include special consecrated stones in the foundation to ward off evil. Imagine yourself sitting quietly in a wooden pew, the flickering candlelight casting shadows that dance on painted saints' faces. You hear the solemn voice of the priest reciting prayers, a comfort against the chill of the night outside. Yet, just beyond these walls, the villagers whisper about the restless dead and the need for constant vigilance. The church also played a social role, guiding communal behavior and enforcing rituals that helped the village navigate the unknown. The blending of Christian and folk traditions created a rich tapestry of belief that sustained people through terrifying times. So, as you absorb the heavy silence and whispered prayers, remember that the church was both a sanctuary and a battlefield in the war against the vampire myth, a place where faith, fear, and folklore collided. You find yourself wandering the shadowy outskirts of the village as twilight fades into night. The air grows colder, thicker with the weight of stories passed down through generations. Tonight, you'll hear about the villagers' strange attempts to predict who might become a vampire, and, even more unsettling, how sometimes those feared to be vampires were the living themselves. One well-documented practice was the identification of vampire candidates even before death. Villagers watched closely for certain signs, unusual birthmarks, a mysterious wound that never healed, or a person who never seemed to cast a reflection. These individuals were often treated with suspicion, their behavior scrutinized for anything that hinted at an otherworldly curse. Historically, the fear of living vampires was not uncommon. For example, people suffering from conditions like porphyria or tuberculosis were often mistaken for the undead because of their pale skin, sensitivity to light, or coughing fits. These medical misunderstandings fueled the myth and intensified fear within communities. A fascinating fringe belief held that some villagers could transform into vampires at will, like shapeshifters who drained the life force of others in secret. While this is mostly folklore, it reflects a deep anxiety about betrayal and hidden evil within the community. Historians still argue whether these suspicions about the living were rooted in psychological projection or attempts to explain sudden misfortunes like illness and death. Some suggest that accusing certain people of vampirism was a way to enforce social norms or punish those who deviated from the community. One quirky practice related to identifying vampires involved placing poppy seeds or rice in front of a suspected person. According to folklore, vampires were compelled to count these grains endlessly, distracting them from harming others. It's as if villagers weaponized obsessive counting as a protective charm. Imagine being watched by your neighbors, every twitch or cough interpreted as a sign of something sinister. The fear that your own family member might rise again to haunt you created a tense atmosphere of mistrust and paranoia. These suspicions weren't merely superstition. They influenced how villagers treated each other, shaped alliances, and sometimes led to tragic outcomes like exile or execution. So, as you walk through this wary village, know that the boundary between the living and the undead was not always clear, and sometimes The greatest fear was of those right beside you. You step into the dimly lit village tavern, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and fermented fruit. The hearth crackles softly, casting a warm glow on weathered faces hunched over mugs, sharing tales that ripple like shadows across generations. Here, the stories of vampires aren't just whispered fears. They're a kind of folklore, a communal heartbeat that stitches the past to the present. In these gathering places, oral traditions preserved the legends, passing them down like treasured heirlooms. Songs, poems, and stories detailed encounters with the undead, often framed as cautionary tales about morality, death, and the fragile line between life and the afterlife. A historical fact worth noting: ballads about vampires were common throughout Eastern Europe, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, reflecting widespread belief and fear. These songs sometimes served as warnings or explanations for sudden deaths and illnesses. What's delightfully quirky is that some vampire stories included humorous elements, portraying vampires as bumbling or vain. Far from the fearsome creatures of later Gothic literature, these anecdotes softened the terror, making the myth more relatable, even laughable at times. Historians still argue whether these tales evolved primarily as social commentary, entertainment, or genuine belief. Many think the narratives were a way for communities to cope with loss and uncertainty by giving shape to the invisible threats around them. In fact, storytelling became a subtle form of control, reinforcing cultural norms and values. Characters in these tales often faced consequences for pride, greed, or disrespecting the dead, tying moral lessons to the supernatural. Imagine sitting there yourself, mug in hand, the low murmur of voices weaving a tapestry of dread and humor. A storyteller might lean forward, eyes glinting, recounting how a clever villager outwitted a vampire by tricking it into counting grains of salt until dawn. You notice how these stories create a sense of shared identity, binding villagers in mutual understanding and vigilance. They remind you that fear, after all, is a social experience, shaped and shared in community spaces like this tavern. So, as you listen to the flickering tales and laughter mingling, realize that vampire lore wasn't just about monsters. It was about people, their fears, hopes, and the stories they told to make sense of a dark world. You trudge along the edge of a fog-drenched graveyard, the chill seeping through your cloak as the skeletal branches overhead claw at the gray sky. Here, in this liminal space between life and death, the village's fears take their darkest and most physical form: the exhumation of corpses suspected of vampirism. This grim practice was both a horrifying necessity and a desperate measure to protect the living. Historical records from the 17th and 18th centuries reveal that exhumations were surprisingly common in certain regions. Villagers would dig up the freshly buried dead, searching for telltale signs of vampirism: uncorrupted skin, blood at the mouth, or a corpse that appeared unnaturally preserved. Such signs were seen as proof the deceased was not resting peacefully, but rising nightly to feed on the living. One particularly unsettling detail is that some corpses were found with their hair or nails seemingly grown since death, or with blood dripping from the mouth, phenomena we now understand as natural post-mortem changes, but which terrified people then. The lack of scientific knowledge fueled paranoia and justified brutal actions. Historians still argue whether these exhumations were mostly rooted in superstition or were reactions to real fears prompted by outbreaks of disease and unexplained deaths. Some scholars suggest these rituals served to quell panic by giving people a sense of control over their environment. A quirky tradition involved using mirrors during exhumations, placing them near the body to detect reflections or souls trapped in the corpse. If the vampire appeared in the mirror, it was believed to confirm the curse. Imagine the village gathered, faces pale and tense, as grave diggers unearthed a coffin. The air would be thick with tension, mixed with the damp smell of earth and decay. These were not pleasant moments. They were communal acts of dread and hope. If a vampire was discovered, the body might be staked, burned, or decapitated. Such measures were meant to ensure the dead would not harm the living, but they also tore at the social fabric. As families grappled with the horror of what their loved ones might have become. This practice wasn't universal, and some religious authorities discouraged exhumations, warning against disturbing the dead. Yet in many villages, the fear overrode such concerns. So, as you stand in that foggy graveyard, understand that these acts of exhumation were the village's grim way of holding the darkness at bay, confronting death itself with hands trembling but resolute. You wander deeper into the village at dusk, where superstition seeps into everyday routines, and even the simplest actions carry a weighty meaning. The fear of vampires shaped not only graveyards and rituals, but also the way people lived their daily lives, governing who they trusted, where they walked, and how they prepared for the night. One well-documented custom was the strict avoidance of certain places after sunset. Villagers believed that crossroads, forests, and even some wells could be hot spots for vampire activity. You might find yourself walking a longer, safer route to avoid these danger zones, feeling the eyes of your community watching your every step. Historically, these spatial restrictions were common, especially in times of plague or famine when fear was heightened. Boundaries were carefully maintained, with people barred from roaming at night to reduce the risk of encountering vampires, or worse, becoming one. Interestingly, some villages marked these boundaries with protective symbols, like crosses etched into doorways or stones painted with garlic. The idea was to create invisible lines that vampires could not cross. This concept of sacred geography influenced the very layout of many villages. Historians still argue whether these spatial taboos were primarily about supernatural fear or practical concerns about safety and crime. Some scholars suggest that limiting nighttime movement was as much about social control as it was about warding off the undead. A quirky detail involves villagers carrying small whistles or bells when walking at night, supposedly to scare off vampires or alert others if danger approached. You can imagine the faint tinkling sound weaving through the darkness, a strange soundtrack to a night full of fear. Imagine the unease you'd feel living under these restrictions, knowing your freedom was curtailed by unseen terrors. Trust was fragile. Neighbors might suspect each other of secret dealings with the undead, adding a layer of paranoia to everyday life. These fears also shaped household routines. Doors were barred early, windows shuttered tight, and fires kept burning long after the sun went down. Garlic wreaths hung not only at entrances but also near beds, offering a small comfort against the night's chill. So, as you imagine moving cautiously through this world governed by shadows and suspicion, remember that the fear of vampires extended far beyond the grave. It molded the very rhythms of life in the village. You step inside a dimly lit cottage, where the flicker of a single candle casts warm light on simple wooden furnishings and dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. In this home, superstition merges with practical medicine, as villagers rely on folk remedies both to heal the living and to guard against the dead who might rise again. Herbal knowledge was crucial. Garlic, wormwood, vervain, and hawthorn weren't just kitchen spices. They were sacred tools believed to repel vampires. You notice a bundle of garlic cloves strung near the hearth, a talisman against nocturnal predators. The pungent aroma fills the air, sharp and reassuring. Historically, many of these herbs had actual medicinal properties, like antiseptic or calming effects. Garlic, for example, was used to treat infections, so its protective reputation wasn't entirely superstition. It also helped fight real illness. A quirky folk practice involved burying a sick person's belongings beneath the threshold or sprinkling holy water mixed with crushed herbs around the home to purify the space. Such acts blurred the line between healing and protection, demonstrating the villagers' desire to control what they could in a world full of uncertainties. Historians still argue whether these herbal customs derive primarily from pagan rituals or Christian influence, or if they were a syncretic blend evolving over centuries. Some scholars suggest that the practical benefits of these plants helped preserve ancient beliefs. You imagine the comforting routine of crushing herbs, tying wreaths, and murmuring prayers while the wind howls outside. These rituals grounded people in their daily lives, giving a sense of agency over the invisible threats beyond their walls. One odd but fascinating detail is the use of a wooden stake, not just to pierce suspected vampire hearts, but also sometimes as a walking stick to ward off evil spirits during travel. It's a reminder that fear shaped tools and objects, turning everyday items into instruments of defense. In moments like this, the boundary between superstition and survival blurs, and you realize how tightly woven belief and practicality were in the lives of these villagers. So, as you sit by that flickering candlelight, remember that these herbal rituals were more than myth. They were lifelines in a dark, uncertain world. You find yourself standing at the edge of a village well, the water's surface dark and still beneath a heavy moon. Wells were essential lifelines for villages, but they were also sources of anxiety. Some believed that the restless dead could lurk beneath the water, or even drag victims down into watery graves. Historical accounts describe villagers throwing garlic cloves, poppy seeds, or iron nails into wells to purify the water and prevent vampire activity. This act was both symbolic and practical, an attempt to secure one of their most vital resources from supernatural harm. Interestingly, some folk beliefs held that vampires could only rise from bodies buried near water. which tied water sources closely to fears of the undead. These anxieties meant wells were often sites of ritual cleansing and prayer. Historians still argue whether these water-related rituals stemmed primarily from symbolic purification, contamination fears, or both. Water has long been associated with cleansing in many cultures, but here it also represented a boundary between life and death. A curious and somewhat quirky practice involved villagers lowering mirrors into wells to catch reflections of any lurking spirits, believing that the mirror's surface could reveal hidden threats. Imagine peering into the dark water, hoping to glimpse nothing at all. The well was not just a physical source of water, but a focal point for communal fears and protective magic. Villagers might gather here for rites or place protective charms around the well's mouth to guard the community. You can almost feel the cold, damp air surrounding you, the soft dripping of water, a constant reminder of life's fragility in this haunted landscape. The well, essential yet feared, became a symbol of the delicate balance villagers struggled to maintain. So, as you gaze into that still water, remember that even the most mundane elements of village life were woven tightly with the thread of vampire fear, a fear that shaped not just bodies and souls, but also the very environment itself. You shuffle along the worn path toward the village edge, where the forest thickens into an almost impenetrable wall of twisted trees and tangled underbrush. This is the wild borderland where superstition thrives, and the fear of vampires takes on a darker, more primal form. Forests were both feared and revered. Villagers believed they were the hunting grounds for vampires and other malevolent spirits. To enter after dark was considered almost suicidal. People avoided these places, especially when the mist settled thick and heavy like a ghostly blanket. Historically, forested regions of Eastern Europe often saw heightened vampire panic, especially during plague years when death was rampant and explanations scarce. The unknown dangers of the woods became metaphors for the unknown threat of vampirism. One odd but intriguing belief was that vampires could transform into animals, wolves, bats, or owls, and roam the forest to hunt the living. This shape-shifting idea likely developed from local myths and the natural nocturnal habits of these creatures. Historians still argue whether such animal transformations were rooted in pre-Christian pagan traditions or emerged later through folk tales mixing with religious influences. The overlap of animal lore and vampire myth makes it hard to disentangle fact from fiction. A quirky detail is that villagers sometimes carried small bells or whistles into the forest, believing the sound would ward off evil spirits. You might imagine a faint jingling drifting eerily through the trees, a fragile defense against the dark. Imagine standing at the forest's edge, heart pounding, the thick shadows hiding unseen eyes. This boundary between the known village and the unknown wild was a place of tension, where the line between safety and danger blurred. These fears shaped village boundaries, travel habits, and even the timing of hunting and gathering. Avoiding the forest after dusk was as much about social survival as it was about superstition. So, as you peer into the dark, tangled woods, Remember that this shadowy borderland was more than wilderness. It was a stage where human fears played out against the unknown, and where vampire legends thrived in the night. You enter a humble village church, its wooden pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers seeking solace and protection. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with incense and whispered prayers. Religion was a cornerstone of village life, and deeply intertwined with the fear of vampires. Historically, Christian rituals were adapted to combat vampirism. Priests conducted blessings over graves, sprinkled holy water, and held special masses to protect souls from returning as the undead. The churchyard itself was often considered a sacred boundary, and burials inside consecrated ground were thought to prevent vampiric resurrection. A curious, lesser-known fact is that some villagers believed that priests' prayers could weaken or even destroy vampires, turning religious rites into spiritual weapons. Holy symbols like crosses or crucifixes were carried as amulets, offering both faith and tangible protection. Historians still argue whether the Church fully endorsed these beliefs or saw them as superstitions competing with official doctrine. In some cases, clergy condemned vampire lore as pagan nonsense. In others, they incorporated it into sermons to address community fears. Interestingly, there was a tension between scientific explanations emerging in the Enlightenment and traditional beliefs. Some clergy found themselves walking a delicate line, respecting folk fears while promoting reason. You can almost hear the low chanting of a mass, the rustling of robes, the soft clinking of chains as villagers lined up for blessings. This sacred atmosphere lent hope in a world overshadowed by death and the unknown. One quirky tradition was the use of consecrated soil, sprinkled over graves, or even carried in small pouches, believed to protect the living from vampire attacks. It's a reminder how tangible faith became, a physical shield against intangible fears. As you sit quietly in that church pew, the flicker of candlelight dances, and you realize how the church both soothed and fueled vampire fears, offering comfort but also reinforcing the unseen forces that shaped village life. So, in this holy place, remember that faith and fear coexisted uneasily, each shaping the other in a dance as old as the villages themselves. You find yourself at the village funeral, a somber affair tinged with unease, where the line between mourning and fear blurs. Death here isn't just a passage, it's a potential threat, a door that might open again if the deceased rise as vampires. Your eyes scan the gathering crowd, noticing the anxious glances exchanged, the whispered warnings to watch the body closely. Historically, funerals in Eastern Europe carried unique customs designed to prevent vampirism. Bodies were often buried with heavy stones or iron spikes to pin them down, or with sickles placed across their necks, tools meant to trap or harm a possible vampire trying to escape its grave. You feel the weight of these measures, a mix of reverence and dread. A quirky, almost theatrical practice involved placing sharp objects or garlic cloves in the coffin to deter the undead. Sometimes the body's mouth was sewn shut or filled with soil, preventing it from feeding on the living. Imagine the eerie quiet, the collective breath held as the grave is closed. Historians still argue whether these burial customs were primarily driven by genuine vampire fears or were part of broader apotropaic rituals meant to ward off evil spirits in general. The overlap makes it hard to untangle pure vampire lore from other superstitions. You notice a subtle tension between grief and relief. Families hoping the deceased find peace but prepared for the worst. Funerals were moments when the village confronted death's mystery head-on. One lesser-known detail is the belief that funerals held at night were riskier, as vampires were thought to be more active under moonlight, leading some communities to schedule burials at dawn or midday. You might shudder imagining the urgency behind these timings. As you watch the final rites, the low murmur of prayers, and the earth's cold embrace remind you that these rituals were as much about protection as they were about saying goodbye. So, standing among these mourners, you see how the shadow of vampirism cast its long reach even over the most sacred moments of life's end, an ever-present fear wrapped in tradition and faith. You walk along a narrow village street lined with modest houses whose windows glow softly against the growing dusk. Here, community life pulses with routines that have, over generations, been shaped by the persistent fear of vampires. Trust isn't given lightly. Neighbors watch each other, sharing whispers of suspicion beneath breathy sighs. In these villages, gossip was a double-edged sword. It could save lives by alerting people to suspicious behavior, like someone visiting graves at odd hours or acting strangely. But it also bred paranoia, as anyone could be accused of vampirism or consorting with the undead. Historically, accusations of vampirism sometimes led to violence. People were staked, beaten, or banished based on fear and rumor. These acts, though brutal, reveal how seriously the threat was taken and how social cohesion depended on identifying outsiders or dangerous individuals. A quirky detail is that some villages carried small pieces of garlic or iron in their pockets as daily protection, a habit that blended superstition with practicality, like a medieval lucky charm. You might chuckle imagining the scent of garlic wafting through crowded streets. Historians still argue whether vampirism accusations served as social control tools, a way to manage fear and maintain order in tight-knit communities. These accusations often reflected deeper anxieties about outsiders or the unknown. You notice how communal rituals, like shared meals or evening prayers, functioned as bonding exercises, reinforcing trust and collective security against the invisible menace. These gatherings were as much about reassurance as tradition. The delicate balance between suspicion and solidarity meant that villagers had to walk a fine line, welcoming neighbors, but always watching for signs of danger. So, as you weave through these winding streets, you understand how vampire fear shaped not just the physical, but also the social fabric, turning everyday life into a careful dance between connection and caution. You stand at the edge of a village graveyard at twilight, where the air feels thick with the scent of damp earth and fading flowers. The cemetery is not just a place of rest. It's a front line in the war against the undead, a carefully guarded boundary between the living and the dead. In many Eastern European villages, graves were marked with specific symbols intended to ward off vampires: crosses, inverted pentagrams, or even carved stakes. Some were surrounded by fences made from thorny branches or iron spikes, designed to keep restless spirits confined. A lesser-known, rather curious practice was the vampire trap grave, a burial site prepared with heavy stones or iron chains, sometimes with the body placed face down to confuse any spirit trying to rise. You can almost imagine the anxiety that led to such elaborate precautions. Historians still argue whether these symbols and traps reflected actual vampire fears or broader concerns about restless dead in general. The cultural overlap means it's difficult to say where vampire lore ends and graveyard superstition begins. The graveyard was also a place of nocturnal vigilance. Villagers sometimes organized watch groups to patrol cemeteries at night, armed with stakes, holy water, and garlic. This combination of community effort and individual belief made the graveyard both a place of fear and resilience. One quirky detail is the belief that freshly turned soil, sometimes scattered with poppy seeds or hemp, could prevent the dead from digging their way out. Imagine sprinkling tiny seeds with the hope that growth and life would keep death contained. As you stand there, shadows lengthening, the graveyard seems alive with the tension of unseen threats and protective rituals. It's a place where the living confront mortality's mysteries with hope, fear, and a touch of desperate magic. So, as night deepens, remember that these cemeteries were more than resting places. They were battlegrounds where folklore, faith, and fear met under the moon's watchful eye. You find yourself drawn to the flickering glow of a solitary candle placed on a windowsill, a simple yet powerful talisman against the night's terrors. Light, in many villages, was one of the strongest defenses against vampirism, a symbol of life, hope, and the sacred. Villagers often left candles burning through the night to ward off evil spirits and vampires, believing that darkness gave the undead their strength. This practice connected with the ancient idea that vampires feared sunlight and fire, the twin forces of purification. A quirky bit of folklore held that certain herbs, when burned alongside candles, enhanced their protective power. Mugwort, rosemary, and rue were favorites, their scents thought to repel evil as much as their flames illuminated the dark. Historians still argue whether candlelight rituals were purely symbolic, or if they had a practical function in alerting villagers to danger. After all, a well-lit home made surprise attacks harder and gave people a psychological edge against fear. You might imagine a line of flickering flames casting long shadows on the village walls, each candle a tiny beacon against the creeping night. The gentle hum of the burning wick mixed with the occasional whisper of the wind creates an oddly soothing backdrop. One lesser-known tradition was the placement of candles around a newly buried grave to ensure the deceased did not rise. This delicate circle of light was a fragile barrier, a hope against darkness. As you watch those flames dance, you realize how such simple acts, lighting a candle, burning an herb, were profound gestures of courage, defiance, and community resilience in the face of overwhelming fear. So, as the night deepens around you, let the flicker of that candle remind you how light, however small, has long been humanity's quiet rebellion against the shadows. You follow the faint sound of a distant bell ringing through the village night, a reminder that Even amidst fear, life carries on with rituals both practical and symbolic. Bells played a surprisingly vital role in vampire lore, their clear tones believed to chase away evil spirits and restless dead. Historically, the ringing of church bells at specific times, especially during storms or eclipses, was thought to protect villages from vampire attacks. The vibrations were believed to disrupt the supernatural forces animating the undead, forcing them to retreat. A quirky practice involved villagers carrying small bells or rattles as personal protection. The constant jingling wasn't just noise, it was an auditory shield, a way to keep unseen dangers at bay. Imagine a village where the air is filled with the tinkling sounds of jingling bells, almost like an odd bedtime music. Historians still argue whether these beliefs originated from pagan traditions or were later Christianized to fit church practices. The blending of old and new makes vampire lore a rich tapestry woven from diverse cultural threads. You notice how bell ringing tied communities together, marking time, signaling danger, and creating a shared rhythm to village life. In many ways, the bell's call was both a warning and a comfort. One fascinating tidbit is the use of bells in funerals. Some villages rang bells at burial to symbolically seal the grave and protect the living from any undead threats. This ritual echoed the broader theme of using sound to combat silence and death. As you listen to the fading echoes of the bell, the haunting melody feels like a final defense against darkness, a call to vigilance, hope, and communal strength. So, as the village settles into night, remember that even in the face of ancient fears, the sound of bells rang out as a reassuring heartbeat, a symbol that life, however fragile, endures. You find yourself sitting by the flickering embers of a dying fire, the night's chill creeping in, but comforted by the warmth and the soft crackle that feels like an old friend whispering stories. After wandering through villages, graveyards, and rituals, you're finally at the edge of this long journey where fear and folklore meet the quiet moments before sleep. Throughout Eastern Europe, the brutal fear of vampires shaped the way people lived, loved, mourned, and protected themselves. You've seen how every nail hammered into a coffin, every candle lit, and every whispered prayer was part of a grand dance with the unknown. A quirky final detail is that some villagers kept vampire traps not just outside, but inside their homes, small charms tucked under pillows, knives placed under beds, and even doors reinforced with iron nails. It's a vivid reminder of how deeply fear could penetrate daily life. Historians still argue whether vampires were ever truly feared as supernatural beings, or if the stories masked deeper social anxieties about disease, death, and the fragile boundary between life and community. This debate leaves room for you to wonder what really lurked behind those old legends. Now, as the embers glow low, you might feel a gentle calm settle, the ancient terrors fading into the soft hum of your own breathing. The shadows that once danced at the edges of your vision are retreating. So, as you prepare to drift off, remember that the brutal fear of vampires was not just about monsters in the night. It was a mirror reflecting human vulnerability, resilience, and the timeless need to find light in the darkness. The fire's warmth wanes, and the night wraps you in a velvet quietness that feels like a soft blanket. Every breath you take is slow, deep, and steady, an invitation to relax further. The shadows that once whispered tales of fear have softened into gentle shapes, no longer threatening, but comforting companions on this twilight journey. The old villages, the graveyards, and the flickering candles all fade gently, like a distant lullaby you can almost hear but don't quite catch. There is peace here, a sense that the stories, though filled with dread, carry a hidden kindness. They remind us that fear has always been part of the human story, shaping how we protect ourselves and how we come together. Now, you can let go of the heavy weight of those ancient fears and settle into the calm of your own space. Let your mind float softly, free from shadows, buoyed by the quiet glow of the embers. Tonight, the night's mysteries rest quietly, and so can you. Sleep well, knowing that the darkness holds no harm here, only rest and dreams waiting to unfold gently with the coming dawn.